Greetings Dungeon Dorks and welcome to the Arkanthan Archive. In my last video I set out to tell the tale of how I went from a Doom guy subsisting solely on an appetite of high-powered, gore-drenched futurist ultra-violence to a dragon man, an enthusiastic uber-nerd fantasy convert. It was a bit like being born anew, regaining consciousness on the cart ride in Skyrim. Recording, editing and unleashing my verbose, self-reflective video was a really enjoyable and interesting experience for me which I've been itching to repeat. It's a great feeling to write again and explore topics that are important and interesting to me. I haven't worked on something so intensely since I was in education, and I had to chip away at it bit by bit just so I wouldn't get burnt out. It was very time consuming and sometimes it was tedious, but I set myself a target and I met it. I'd been wanting to make my own YouTube essay for some time, and the idea that once I was finished I'd be able to stick it on the big TV, sit back and enjoy the end product, that really spurred me on to finish it. All this to say that I'm really proud of myself for having a goal and achieving it, which is sort of what I'd like to delve into with this video. Full disclosure, I'm going to be geeking out pretty hard about a game that I love, there will be spoilers for the game in question, and some bad language and subject matter that you might find disturbing or distressing. But with all that out of the way, let's get stuck into it. It takes something really special for me to get absolutely absorbed by it, whether it's a video game, a band or a TV show, but when my ADHD charged hyperfixation hits, it hits like a truck and then I'm locked in. I'll listen to a song 60 times in a row, or I'll play the same audiobook to go to sleep to for a whole year, or watch the same sitcom on Netflix on loop, because there's comfort in repetition. It's that same feeling of comforting repetition that might explain why I played nothing but Morrowind for almost a year straight, or why I can never quite seem to stay focused on Oblivion after the subterranean tutorial section. I like Oblivion, I just can't seem to stick with it. Like, I've literally never completed it, I should probably do that someday. But whenever I get the Oblivion bug, I usually just start a new character to whiz through the tutorial, and for a few hours after that. You know what I mean? It's just fun. It's a fun game. And I think the reason I'm chasing this nostalgia hit is because I spent a lot of time with one of my mates in my teenage years watching with mild curiosity while he played it on his Xbox 360, God knows how many years ago. Oh my god, that was almost 20 years ago. Back then we would hang out in his room and I would watch him play Oblivion. And I was quietly impressed by the way that he effortlessly moved his way through the dungeon, dispatching rats, zombies and goblins with ease, and flawlessly lockpicked a hard level chest. He made it look easy, and of course when you've played a game multiple times it is, but when you watch someone do something cool and do it effortlessly, you sometimes think to yourself, I want to do that too. Or at least I do. You'd probably be more likely to find me swinging swords these days than loading a shotgun, but I am nothing if not a devoted enthusiast of video game violence. You can change the setting from the cold Durasteel corridors of the Khajiit outpost in Jedi Outcast to the West Gash region of Morrowind, but the pleasure receptors in my brain still know what they like, and that is meting out merciless retribution against polygonal foes with extreme prejudice. I like feeling powerful, unstoppable and precise, especially when I'm zoned into the flow of combat and movement in a video game. Some games are obviously designed with this flow sensation at the core of their design philosophy, and you can really tell when that's the case, and perhaps when it isn't. With that being said, some of my favourite games are kind of the opposite of power fantasies. They take some of the power away from the player, whether that's in the form of resource scarcity or anxiety-inducing encounters with particularly aggressive and numerous enemies. They put you in the driving seat of an experience that, if you were actually living through it, it would probably traumatise you for life. Let's use, I don't know,
Resident Evil 4
as an example of this. Leon S. Kennedy is an agile, wisecracking killing machine who can spin kick your nan so hard her head explodes, but he's no less susceptible to a rusty chainsaw to the neck as you or I. I remember playing the opening level on a demo disc that I got with a Nintendo magazine, and the first 10 to 15 minutes or so are a masterclass in tension, dread, and making the player feel overwhelmed, all despite Leon's martial arts prowess and handiness with a combat knife. Once you enter the iconic village arena, a seemingly endless swarm of hatchet-wielding ganados appear from everywhere all at once, and it's all you can do to keep your distance from them or try to kill as many as possible before the church bell chimes. I've played the game countless times, and even now when I get to the village and start blasting my way through the horde, there are moments where it feels like this sequence might never stop. There are those terrifying moments on higher difficulties when I notice that the ammo counter on the bottom right hand of the screen reads empty. That small swollen red circle with that single word in its centre makes me feel something that very few other games have. Panic. Resi 4 has a horde mode called Mercenaries, which is unlocked after you complete the game on any difficulty setting, where players can challenge themselves to kill as many enemies as they can in a time trial setting. After playing the Mercenaries mode extensively over nearly 20 years, this is where I began to see playing the game as sort of an art form. It's absolutely crucial to your survival that you use all the resources available to you, know your arsenal and the layout of the map inside and out, and be able to think on your feet as two chainsaw villagers charge you at once. It's a competitive arena, it's an arcade mode really, but I think it's also a training ground for the base game. Playing on the professional difficulty turns Resident Evil 4 into a completely different beast. Every room and area of the game becomes a test of the player's ability to micro-strategize every step, or in other words, the player is managing a series of encounters. Every enemy placement, every aspect of the environment works against you in certain ways, and you need to be responsive in order to survive it. Inevitably, learning how to manage encounters will lead to a lot of deaths, but if you can persist, think fast, and just remember the controls, you're going to make it and you're going to become more fluid and locked into the game in the process. This is a feature of retro games where the experience is identical every time you pick up the controller. It's how people become pros at Super Mario or Sonic. They've memorized it, right? I believe that Resident Evil 4's younger brother Dead Space perfected managing encounters with its gloriously gross dismemberment system, familiar weapon and resource management, and impressively sneaky enemy AI. There are carefully designed encounters within the screaming sarcophagus of the USG Ishimura that can feel unfair at times at higher difficulties, but given the opportunity to reattempt, adapt, and try out different strategies, you'll eventually be victorious, albeit drenched in blood and viscera. It's this concept of managing encounters that brings me to the true topic of this video. It's about a game that has occupied a semi-permanent spot in the disc tray of my PlayStation since 2022. It's a towering, tentacled entity that carries the stench of death, rusted steel, and rotten squid. It's a traumatic, twisted tale and an experience that tested every fibre of my being as a gamer and remains one of my all-time favourites. It's Bloodborne. From Software's 2015 masterpiece Bloodborne needs no introduction, but I'll briefly summarise it for anyone who hasn't played or heard of it. And well, I mean, if you haven't played it, you need to go and play it. It's an action RPG with a stylish gothic horror setting, positively drenched in atmosphere, and a uniquely vicious fight-to-the-death gameplay style. It's mysterious, scary, gross, and above all, extremely challenging. It is impeccable. You play as a sickly traveller who has arrived on the dank gothic streets of Yharnam, seeking a cure for an unspecified affliction, specifically something named pale blood. Yharnam is renowned for a procedure known as blood healing, administered to the general public by members of the Healing Church, with, shall we say, unfortunate results. In the process of receiving a transfusion of intoxicating Yharnam blood, you enter into a quasi-dream state in which you are unendingly awake yet unable to truly die, reawakening time and time again after being slaughtered in a maddening loop-de-loop. In exchange for the transfusion, you sign a contract and you have entered into an arrangement. You are now a beast hunter, and it's your job to cleanse the streets of the impure. Yharnam has been devastated by a horrid scourge, and its townsfolk have been transformed into, among other things, deranged, shambling freaks that patrol the streets with torches, pitchforks, and hatchets, attacking you on sight. Interestingly, despite their deformities, they regard you as the beast intruder, trying to ward you off with their torches, and saying stuff like,
"You plague-ridden rats!"
Regrettably, there seems to be no way back for the poor Yharnam townies, so they need to be sent back to hell. The narrative escalates from a fairly vanilla gothic horror to the heights of surrealist Lovecraftian terror. The abominations skulking the streets become gradually stranger and more deadly. The game takes you on a bizarre, blood-drenched adventure that takes place over the course of a single night, the night of the hunt, and your objective, as I understand it, is to wake up from the nightmare. The story isn't told explicitly, but it can be pieced together through cutscenes, encounters with NPCs, environmental storytelling, and item descriptions. But even then, it's hard to precisely say what happens in the game based on the experience alone. But FromSoft lore is an economy in itself on YouTube, so go nuts and check out some channels if you're looking for a 3-hour deep dive. That's not really what I'm here to do. This video is an exploration of my personal development with a game that pushed me to my absolute limits. I picked up this game after seeing a meme about it on Twitter, thinking it looked pretty sick, but when I first tried playing it, I was completely baffled by it. The jarring true directional movement, the weird interface, and because I'd never played a From Software game before, the almost debilitating difficulty just made me feel defeated and annoyed. I loved the look of the game, the sharp edges and architectural verticality. The way the character jogs and descends ladders has this very creepy silent film quality to it, which I'm sure is intentional. There's a vampiric quality to the player's movement, and you get the impression that Bram Stoker's Dracula, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and Jack the Ripper, the evil surgeon of Whitechapel, were all major influences. But I was thrown off by how weird it felt to control, how enemies could just thwack me twice and I'd just die, and I didn't really understand the function of the Hunter's Dream hub world. What's with the row of gravestones, and why does this one just take me back to Yharnam? I was already there, and what's that doll doing there? All of these confusing aspects combined with a feeling of being totally out of my depth and baby-handed with this intimidating game ended up with me dropping it all together and glumly returning to Vardenfell. At least you're easy to play, my beloved. The Bloodborne disc sat quietly in its case for now. A couple of months later, a friend of mine came over to my house and upon sitting down in my living room, noticed the game sitting in a pile of other PS4 titles. He was like, "Oh, you've got Bloodborne." Could really hear the excitement in his voice. I said something like, "Yeah man, I'm not too into it though. It's too hard." He asked me, "Do you mind if I play some Bloodborne?" And off he went. I watched in amazement as my friend breezed through the game, executing the demented townsfolk with frightening finesse, his fingers and thumbs working effortlessly over the controller. I was stunned, to be perfectly honest. I couldn't fathom how anyone could make sense of the jarring controls, or be brave enough to take on the lumbering, torch-wielding foes that had confounded and brutalised me before. I couldn't help but notice that when he rounded the corner of the carriage at this point, he immediately dispatched the snoozing top-hatted rifleman on the other side, and it dawned on me that he had memorised the game. And yeah, he confirmed to me that he did pretty much know the game off by heart, because he'd played nothing else through all of COVID. He explained to me that he wanted to become really, really good at playing this game, and while I was watching him play it, that familiar voice in my head told me, "You want to do that too." So that was where the first seed was planted. Not only did I want to finish this game, but I wanted to train my brain to play it really well. Thank you, Seamus, I wouldn't be here without you. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. You've ruined my life. I'm just teasing. In retrospect, this was definitely a pivotal moment when I realised that Bloodborne isn't random chaos. It isn't unsurpassable or impossible as I had once thought. It's a bit like a survival horror game, and it's a series of encounters. It had been genuinely enthralling watching my friend glide through Central Yharnam as if it was a leisurely stroll, peeling off well-timed blasts from the hunter pistol and gleefully celebrating visceral attacks, slashing with the saw cleaver as if it were a serrated extension of his arm. But I still wasn't feeling confident enough to take it on and commit my precious free time to a game that I simply believed I was bad at. My FromSoft whackness was laid bare with every panic-stricken failed attempt to get past the first crowd of enemies in the alleyway. I just had no idea what I was doing. 2022 saw the release of Elden Ring, From Software's magnum opus, and I'd utterly fallen in love with the game since the unveiling of the first trailer. I really wanted to play this game, and I know this sounds ridiculous, but I didn't know at the time that it had any relation to the bleak gothic slasher game that was burning a hole in my backlog. Anyway, release day rolled round and I dived headfirst into Elden Ring, and as I did, I couldn't help but think that I'd seen this interface somewhere before. The screen-centered character, the XP counter, health and stamina bars. And I was kind of thinking like, ah shit, this is made by the people who made Bloodborne, isn't it? I know this is probably really funny to Souls vets, but I never played Dark Souls, and miraculously the online discourse around Elden Ring had somehow insulated me from connecting the dots. Either that or I'm just naturally incurious. You have to remember that at this point I wasn't sure if I was even enjoying myself playing these games. But all was not lost, as Elden Ring gives players what FromSoft deprived them of in their previous entries in the Souls series, an honest-to-God tutorial section. Which, by the way, is totally optional. It's there if you want to utilise it, and I think that's a really nice touch. In Elden Ring, the tutorial section has pop-up screens which lay out in plain English how this works, what happens if you do that, and it's honestly perfect for smooth brains like myself. At the end of the tutorial, a basic enemy is presented as a boss, which is kind of funny, but it primes the player for their imminent encounters with many more of these same soldiers in Limgrave in short order. But anyway, once I'd completed the Elden Ring tutorial and spent some time kicking around in Limgrave, I realised that it was no wonder I was shit at playing Bloodborne. I hadn't been using the lock-on, or sprint. As these very humiliating realisations dawned on me, it was literally like a fog had lifted. So, it's not that I'm a shit gamer, as countless defeats at the hands of basic enemies in Central Yharnam had almost convinced me. I just didn't have a proper grasp of the game's controls and mechanics, and I hadn't had the courage or patience to invest time in getting to grips with them. Now, I know what you're thinking, that yes, that does actually make you a shit gamer. And yeah, alright, fine. But even so, I stand by the point that for the uninitiated Souls virgin that I was at the time, Bloodborne is far from being straightforward. I spoke to someone else who had a similar experience who lost their Souls virginity to this game, who confessed that they didn't even realise that they could obtain a starter weapon when you visit the Hunter's Dream for the first time, and apparently they made it all the way to the Cleric Beast using only their fists before they realised. It's indicative of the many years I spent playing mind-numbing shooters, which are, if we're going to be real about it, point-and-click games. If like me you're used to a certain degree of hand-holding, and you're used to playing games that follow the formula of point your gun at that guy and shoot him until he dies ad infinitum, Bloodborne with intentionality and actual mental exertion at its core was always going to be a dizzyingly vertical learning curve. The game came out hot on the heels of Dark Souls 2, and From Software had already gained a fierce following of sadists, so while I believe that Bloodborne is probably the best entry point into the series on the whole for a new player, it also assumes that you already have a base understanding of how to play it, or at least that's how it feels. I'd probably recommend playing Elden Ring first, if only to take advantage of that tutorial and find your feet with Souls mechanics. With a renewed interest and curiosity, I decided that I was going to give this game a bloody good go, and I'm so glad I did. I'd spent a little while in the paddling pool in Limgrave, focusing my attention on the gaggle of troops loitering outside the gatefront ruins, as well as mastering the art of using the lock-on system and holding down circle to sprint. And as I was doing this, I could definitely hear some very faint clicking sounds. Don't get it twisted, I was still getting totally dicked over by the Yharnamites, and I was finding it almost impossible to progress farther than the lynch mob in the first alleyway, but I did feel like I was making a little more headway each time. The interconnectivity of Bloodborne's opening level is something else that I didn't truly appreciate until one very kind soul offered to jump on using the online co-op and basically unlock all of the shortcuts for me and hold my hand through the first 2 boss fights. Thanks, Tom. He also revealed to me a staple of the Souls series, and a mechanic which I've leaned on many a time for various reasons. Enemies are on a leash, meaning that if you find yourself in a spot of bother and you need to back up and rethink your strategy, you can literally just run away, and at a certain distance they'll lose interest and return to where they were previously stood. This is the so-called aggro range, or in other words, the distance you are from the enemy determines whether or not they're going to attack you. You don't really need to engage every enemy, it's up to you to decide if there's a chance you're going to get outnumbered and stomped to death, or if you reckon you can take them on. I read somewhere that it's best to take enemies on one at a time when you're tackling large groups. It's a case of making these split-second calculations on which one of them to strike first. This also means that when you're rushing back to a boss, you can run past every single enemy on the way, leaving you with, ideally, max health and all of your resources intact for the fight. I've always been quite impressed by the way that the areas in Bloodborne and the enemy placements are designed with this in mind. If you were to simply flood an area with enemies that can swarm you within seconds, that makes running back to the boss trickier. This leash thing was one of many eureka moments that, if I was tutoring someone else on how to play this game, I'd make a point of telling them that immediately, because if you didn't know this, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the only way to make it safely through any given area would be to kill absolutely everything. And, fuck that for a laugh. But what about the combat, and how exactly does it work? Bloodborne players have at their disposal a thoroughly inventive arsenal of trick weapons and a variety of offhand firearms. as well as an assortment of interesting trinkets such as flaming torches, which can be useful to ward off beast enemies and light your way through dingy areas. Another fascinating mechanic at play with Bloodborne's weapons is that certain weapons are more effective against certain enemies. The Sword Cleaver, for example, is a serrated weapon, and as such it's perfect for inflicting serrated damage on beast enemies. The Tonitrus, with its ability to become electrified, is useful against the Kin, who are weak to bolt damage. And these hidden damage types can get even more obscure than that, with the Kirkhammer and Ludwig's Holy Blade, best weapon in the game, don't at me, that can inflict righteous damage against enemies of the Church, found primarily in Cainhurst Castle. The player can also make use of a selection of consumables, which can add helpful buffs to ordinary weapons, such as fire, bolt, or even arcane damage. Beast blood pellets will increase damage output but increase damage taken, the old hunter bone can hasten your quickstep, beast blood cocktails can be thrown to distract enemies, Molotov cocktails are, well, pretty self-explanatory. Useful too. So there's a lot on offer here in terms of defensive and offensive, strategy and surgery, and you're going to need to get acquainted with these items. Your healing items are blood vials, a small supply of Yharnam blood rapidly injected into the hunter's right leg. These vials are finite, they won't replenish at the lamps as the Estus flasks did at the bonfires in Dark Souls. And this is one of the main criticisms that I consistently see crop up in conversations, that maybe this wasn't a change for the better. Farming enemies to drop them, or accumulate enough currency to purchase them from the bath merchants, can be a bit of a ball ache. But at risk of stating the obvious, you need to use these. I think I was initially apprehensive about wasting what I perceived to be a valuable resource, but you're going to get smacked about a lot in the early game, mid-game, and the late game, the whole game, so use them. They are your lifeline in a world of madness. In terms of player movement and moment-to-moment encounters, it's fast, really fast. Your response times need to be razor sharp, you need to be hot on that quick step button, and above all, you need to be aggressive. The game's genius health regen system means that taking damage from an enemy will leave an impression on your health bar, and if you can hit them back in quick succession, or better yet pull off a visceral, you can probably get all of that health back. When it finally clicks, it is some of the most pure, unfiltered satisfaction that you can get out of an action game, bar none. I decided to use the Hunter Axe as my starting weapon on my first playthrough, generally because I saw big damage number and thought, yeah, that's for me. While the axe goes perfectly hard wielded single-handedly, it was transforming the weapon into its two-handed state that led me to a very memorable and satisfying discovery. As a gang of Yharnamites advanced on me, I held down R2 to perform a charged attack and... oh baby. That moment right there was when this game cracked like an egg, exploded like a cyst, foul-smelling glorious gore pulsating out of it, and it began to feel good. Another eureka moment. Timing is everything. The game wants you to experiment, learn its ways, quite literally get good at it in order for it to feel good. I mean, you're gonna have no chance, otherwise this game is kill or be killed. Each weapon has its own unique feel and moveset, and having settled on the Hunter Axe, at least until I found something better, I began to get into the rhythm of pressing R1 to attack when an enemy that was charging at me was in range, sidestepping to avoid their attacks, and so on. Once you've started to feel comfortable with the flow of combat, the game just cracks wide open. And really, your only obstacle to success is safely navigating the wide, sprawling areas until you can get to the next lamp checkpoint. And just try not to get shunted off of a cliff by some bastard who pops out from behind a corner when you've got several thousand blood echoes in your pouch. The thing that took me a little longer to get my head around was the game's parrying mechanic. The guns in Bloodborne are not particularly powerful, at least until you've leveled up your blood tinge stat or you find the cannon, but they are an integral part of Bloodborne's combat. They can be your saving grace. A gunpowder Hail Mary at just the right moment will stagger an enemy, allowing you to put your arm through them and tear them asunder in a dramatic shower of gore. It's very sick. Once you've learned how to predict attacks, the trolls are great for this by the way, big long wind-ups and massive windows to pull off the gunshot stagger, it can become incredibly gratifying and fun. You're also able to pull off a visceral attack by creeping up behind an unsuspecting enemy and hitting them with a charged R2, which will have the same effect. Performing a charged R2 attack from behind a gargantuan pig, plunging your entire arm into its anus, and tearing its rectum out is something that never stops feeling satisfying no matter how many times you do it. God, it does sound bad when you put it like that. In this game, you're able to take out most basic enemies with a couple of attacks, but the kicker is that they can kill you in just as many or fewer. So it becomes a balancing act of pure hateful aggression and strategy. You need to be the first to deliver the killing blow, or you're gonna die. Bloodborne rewards precision as much as it rewards aggression. You can't just spam buttons, you need to be sure. The health bar above the enemy is a useful visual indicator that will tell you how many hits they need. You need to take on enemies one at a time and dispatch them in a series of short, sharp attacks. When you die, you'll respawn at the last checkpoint. Your blood echoes are still out there on a puddle on the floor, or they might have possessed a nearby enemy, indicated by their glowing eyes. Collect them from the floor, or kill the enemy with the glowing eyes, and you've got them back. But if you're killed on the way, or, fell off a ledge trying to get back to them, they're gone for good. And that can really sting if you had a lot of them. It can be extremely controller-smashingly frustrating, but no one ever said it would be easy, and if they did, then they're a fucking liar. Enemies respawn, and they'll always be in the same spot, and this can actually help immensely to make a mental map of the area or farm enemies for blood echoes. It's also helpful in terms of basic training. I used to be petrified of Central Yharnam and I would panic like hell trying to kill all the enemies, but at a certain point it's just muscle memory. Running it now is just second nature. Of course, the boss fights are the main events, and they are desperate, brutal, toe-curling, sweaty, seat-of-your-pants affairs. But if you can kill one of them, it kinda proves that you can kill any of them. The word kinda doing quite a lot of heavy lifting there. There are adversaries in this game that will bring your entire playthrough to a halt. The game G-checks you and refuses to let you proceed until you've defeated the boss. And it can be very, very tough. But luckily the game has been out long enough now that there are well-established methods for killing them efficiently, and there really is no shame in looking for help online if you've been smashing your head against a boss for hours, is there? Yeah, well, I mean, I'm saying there isn't. I've heard the feeling of beating a boss after countless failed attempts as being like a shot of heroin. I can't speak to that exactly from experience, but I do know what they mean. As you see the health bar of the boss that has been mercilessly clapping your cheeks chip down and down to near death, your heart begins racing, palms clammy, you start saying, come on, thoughts flashing in your head of, don't get greedy, until it becomes, just one more hit, oh my god, just one more hit. And then you beat it. There's nothing else quite like it. I used to live in a house share, and my housemates would often comment that they could hear me in my room, either loudly cursing the TV screen, or sometimes whooping in celebration. I try my best to keep gamer rage in check because, let's face it, there's no one forcing me to play these games, and the way they're designed is meant to inflict death on the player as a teachable moment. What did I do wrong? How do I improve? Maybe I need to grind out some levels. Do I experiment with another weapon or utilise consumables? I've heard some people say that they don't let FromSoft failure affect them at all. They simply shrug it off and go again. Not sure if I totally buy that, to be honest. You mean to tell me that you've spent hours and hours being killed by the same boss, and you're just sat there completely expressionless, dispassionately heading into the boss arena time and time again, and you don't even muster a... for fuck's sake. Sounds a bit psychopathic, honestly. Overcoming the odds, training your mind and response times, memorizing attack patterns, becoming good at something which is really difficult, and hacking your way to victory, for me, is an emotional rollercoaster that encompasses all emotions. Mercy of any kind is rare in Bloodborne. Its unrelenting brutality is the stuff of legend, but the game does have a criminally underrated mechanic, which was a welcome and merciful departure from its predecessors. Equip load is gone, and this is just so peak. This is so good. I can't express how much I fucking hate equip load. In previous titles, the weight of weapons and armor you were using determined movement speed. The heavier your equip load, the more sluggishly you would move, and perhaps most frustratingly, it renders the dodge roll almost redundant. The only way to alleviate this was to pump valuable souls into your endurance stat, or find rings or special armor pieces that would reduce the impact of a heavy equip load. I played a good amount of Dark Souls 3 naked for this reason, because I wanted to bonk, but not at the expense of nimble and quick movement. I can't tell you how much I hate carry weight and over-encumbrance. If I'm playing a Bethesda game, I instantly install a mod to give me a bajillion million carry weight, because I don't want anything to impede my fun, and carry weight is not a fun mechanic to navigate. Dropping items because I need to make space for something else, not being able to fast travel because I've got too much stuff in my pockets, it's just the worst. And it doesn't belong anywhere near a game like Bloodborne, where reflexive dodging and swift slashing is crucial to your survival. Thankfully, Bloodborne does away with this bollocks entirely, and the player is now free to wield any weapon, however big and heavy, and most importantly, experiment with the game's many stylish outfits. The armour sets in Bloodborne are fashionable tailor-made trousers, trench coats and hats, spiffing Edwardian attire with varying degrees of resistance to physical and elemental damage types. As you progress through the game, follow certain quest lines, the more unique outfits open up even more possibilities for mixing and matching. I personally love Eileen's Plague Doctor mask and crow feather garb, which is complemented by the game's physics to allow it to catch on the breeze, bouncing and billowing out behind you as you sprint through Yharnam in search of your next victim. The tattered Yahar Ghul set with its hooded helm and cult-like cloak is another personal favourite. The traditional Yharnam hunters adorn themselves with sophisticated finery, top hats and waistcoats and what have you, but the sheer variety of region-specific attire at your disposal is yet another way in which Bloodborne's world-building and presentation stands heads and shoulders above its peers. I'd be remiss if I didn't dedicate some portion of this video to a bit of commentary on the mood of the game, because what a moody game it is. Aesthetically and atmospherically, it's a real ball tickler for horror fans. As the night of the hunt progresses from the faded orange hues of the early evening all the way through to the psychedelic purple of the blood moon phase, it's as if the urban areas of the city are slathered in a sickly slime. It's as if you can see the particles of sickness in the air. To say nothing of its damned inhabitants, the city feels deeply unwell. There is a tangible sense of bleakness that something horribly wrong has happened here, and the city and its people have paid a terrible price for unearthing things in the pursuit of knowledge that were better left buried. But I am curious about how nice a place this really is at the best of times. Stone sculptures depict people gesticulating to the heavens as if they're begging God for mercy. I can't imagine morale was very high, even before the events of the game. Like, imagine looking at this stuff every day on your way to work or the big Tesco's. Then there's the coffins that litter the street, shackled in chains, as if who or whatever had been stuffed in there could conceivably reawaken and break out to gorge on the living. Now, why would there be lots of coffins everywhere if this was a jolly nice place to live? And furthermore, why would they need to be chained up? I think that the coffins propped up against walls and stacked on top of one another are likely to be a feature of a post-infection Yharnam, but it's actually not too far removed from reality. In medieval Europe, people were buried face down, or even vertically head first, to prevent them from reanimating and returning from the dead, so this may well be a Yharnamite custom arising from superstition. And a not entirely misguided superstition either. But the chains could also have been there to prevent Yharnam scallywags from stealing bodies to sell to local institutions for a bit of shrapnel. There are similarities between Yharnam and Victorian Edinburgh, which was an epicentre of anatomical study and a notorious grave-robbing scandal. Two men named William Burke and William Hare would kill people and then sell their cadavers to schools to be dissected and studied for financial compensation, which was a common practice at the time. So I don't know, this is all speculation, but maybe Yharnam does have an issue with body snatcher gangs. Certainly wouldn't surprise me. The carefully placed clutter, statues, gravestones and coffins in Central Yharnam really get the cogs turning, and give the impression of a society that is consumed and surrounded by death and misery on a daily basis. It's chilling. After yet another death, your character respawns at the lamp. You hear the all-too-familiar anvil strike, and then the ghostly audio texture swoops in and then away, and then you're just stood there, silently, while the lamp emits a low, shimmering sound. Yeah, it is quite, spooky, this game. It's striking to me that for the exception of boss encounters, the Hunter's Dream, the anxious ambience of the Upper Cathedral Ward, and the menacing chorus of the Mensis Ritual in the Hippogean Jail, Bloodborne is essentially silent. There's no musical ambience or jump-scare-inducing orchestral stabs when an enemy dives out at you. There's just nothing. It's just you alone with your thoughts in the deathly quiet Yharnam city centre. It's particularly memorable for first-time players when the silence is abruptly cracked by the distant deathcore pig squealing of the cleric beast or the ominous dongs of a bell tower. I think that this sustained silence is a genius decision on From Software's part because the lack of music really enhances the immersion and the atmosphere oozing from every pore of Bloodborne's afflicted skin. However, the game's soundtrack is nothing short of spectacular. Deep, droning cellos produce low, foreboding hums, and slow movements of the bows on the strings are like nails on a chalkboard. It feels so utterly unnerving and dark. The bleak anthem that plays over the main menu, The Night Unfurls, is a perfect microcosm of the game's unmatched orchestral terror. The ghostly yet angelic vocalizations that sit on top of the quivering strings, gradually building in intensity to an almost heavenly transcendence, only to come crashing down in a chord progression that I can only describe as an evil smile cracking across the face of the game, eyebrows arched downwards, a single bead of saliva creeping out of the corner of its mouth. It's an exceptional composition. It's so good, man, they don't miss. The Cleric Beast theme sets the tone for the game with a panic-stricken string section and an anthemic, intense Latin chorus. It's glorious, horrifyingly ethereal. There is a fantastic behind-the-scenes video on the official PlayStation YouTube channel that shows the London Music Works choir who performed the vocals and the musicians who played the score, and I find it fascinating and even a bit emotional watching it being performed by real people. I get goosebumps whenever I watch it. I can't recommend it enough. The song itself reminds me a little bit of the theme that plays at the end of the Saw movies when Jigsaw reveals how his plans have unfolded. One of my other favourite themes from the game is Hail the Nightmare, which is, well, nightmarish. It sits low and subdued in the mix as the player awakes in the Hippogean jail, only to reach this terrible and oppressive intensity as you step outside onto the streets, driving home this image of hooded cultist choirs in tall towers belting out this horrible hymn. Deep ambient vocals that converge in atonal harmonies, a ghastly, deafening prayer to conjure the despicable monstrosity, the One Reborn. My home city of Oxford in the UK is a place of learning, with many of its universities dating back many hundreds of years. While Oxford is very green, pleasant and picturesque in the city centre, its buildings are adorned by grotesque gargoyles, sharp jutting spires, and at least one colonial supervillain. There is a magical centuries-old tradition of revelry in Oxford that dates back to the Dark Ages, which takes place on the morning of the 1st of May, called simply May Day. It's the most important event in the Oxford calendar, as in the modern day it broadly symbolises the transition of the seasons from biting winter and drizzly depressing spring into warmer weather and good vibes and that. There are pagan undertones and pagan overtones. It's recognised by the city's students and local residents alike, culminating in a congregation many thousand strong on Magdalen Bridge at 6 AM to hear the Hymnus Eucharisticus sung by the college's choir from atop a tower on the bridge. I'm not kidding, this is 100% real. It's like Hail the Nightmare, but if it was nice, I guess? Hail the Nice Mare? It's a transcendent, slightly eerie, and if you're totally blasted by that point, as you really should be, ever so slightly uncomfortable experience, despite the angelic quality of the singing that permeates the street. Local families with little kids, old people, sentimental Oxfordians of every sort seem to absolutely love it. And I don't not love it, it's perhaps not my favourite part of May Day. It's all part of it, and you sort of know that you have to go there and see it, but not unlike a lot of religious ceremony and practice, it feels quite medieval and not of this world and time. The city has a deep and closely guarded connection to its educational, political, religious and literary history, and there is something undeniably Yharnam-esque about it, not least because of its cobbled streets, spiky skyline, and intellectual esotericism. Special mention also goes to The First Hunter, which I think is quite honestly one of the best pieces of video game music I've ever heard. We dispense with the unsettling, pounding, orgiastic terror of the other boss themes in favour of desperate, orchestral sadness. It's the perfect musical accompaniment to the two hunters frenziedly slashing away at each other in the field of flowers. It's so thoroughly haunting and sad, and the refrain at about the 1 minute mark is just beautiful. I know that many in the community regard the demented symphony of Ludwig the Accursed as the best in show, giving particular praise to the second phase of the fight, which sounds a bit like an axe murderer let loose in a ballroom dance. But honestly, I don't agree. The first hunter hits so much harder because it's the last thing you expect from a game determined to unsettle you with its soundtrack from the very beginning. It comes in waves and weaves in and out of melancholy and menace, and builds up to this crushing vocal crescendo, which is just breathtaking. The German boss fight takes you by surprise. After many hours of fierce battle against unholy abnegations, I felt real detestation against these distorted mutants, the townsfolk, the rats, the beasts, the alien kin, and especially the cage-headed, laser beam casting bastard Mikolash. Rom, the vacuous spider, and the One Reborn, I hated those guys. And pretty much everything that exists in the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis respectively. I remorselessly celebrated their demise. But despite his ambiguous motives and off-colour comments about the doll, Old Man German is my friend. He told me that he was when we first met. The frail wheelchair-bound old man who sat quietly with me in the workshop as I tinkered with my weapons, who I had heard crying, begging for an end to the eternal wretched dream. An elderly, vulnerable, pitiable patron shackled to a maddening, unending mental reality. After refusing his offer to put me out of my misery, decapitating me and thrusting me back into the waking world, he rises from his chair, burial scythe in hand, energized and determined to definitively cast me out of the dream. The two of us locked in battle in a desperate bid to free the other from the cycle of never-ending death and rebirth. It's emotional, it's really emotional, and I've never really experienced anything quite like it. The voice acting cast deserves some major props here too, with standout performances from Ryan Gage from the Hobbit films as Mob A and Mikolash, Connor Byrne as Father Gascoigne, who I was delighted to discover was the actor for Mike in Tracy Beaker, which was a popular children's TV show in the UK in the early noughties. If you're from the UK and you're fast approaching 30, you definitely watched this show. Alan Cordner as German has got to be one of the most quotable, and me and my more enlightened friends will often exclaim,
"Aha! You must be the new hunter,"
in his frail, gravelly voice. But I think the Bloodborne VA crown really goes to Jacqueline Boson as Eileen, whose understated and almost flat delivery of her iconic lines in that northern British accent gives the vocal performance a rather soothing but very menacing quality. Bloodborne's sound design is unambiguously one of its strongest assets. Your footsteps on the cobblestones, the muffled coughs, spluttering, sobbing and maniacal laughter of townsfolk barricaded in their homes, and of course the dull scraping sound of an axe being dragged against the stone street. The visceral impact of your weapon making contact with an enemy, the whoosh of the blade, the slice, the splatter of blood, the metallic machinery of the trick weapons clunking in and out of different states. The game's chunky sound design almost tingles your back teeth. It's so chewy and satisfying, like chomping down on an enormous steak. The game really looks, feels and sounds like a wild animal. True to its original working title, it really is Project Beast. If the cosmos converges and the game gets a remake, I think it'd be a nice touch if your character became steadily more unhinged as the game progresses. I just want to say I'm not advocating for a fully voiced protagonist, Chris Pratt as John Bloodborne, script by Joss Whedon. The amygdala, he's right behind me, isn't he? I'm talking like heavy, ragged breathing after clearing an area of enemies, cackling with laughter as you deliver flurries of successive attacks, similar to Isaac Clarke's furious profanity when you continuously stomp bodies in Dead Space 2. I think if you were going to add something like this to any of the Souls games, this is where it would make the most sense. I also feel that the way that the game is crafted, the way that it unfolds before you in a series of visual reveals and story beats, beats, if you can really call them that, complements the idea that this game is a kind of protracted murder mystery, or conspiracy, in which the player peels back the layers of intrigue and has to piece together what they think has happened here. The skillful presentation of the game's setting and the sheer quality of its world building is something that I've never really seen anywhere else. It begins as a kind of insect or bug that leads you down a filthy tunnel that becomes gradually wider until you reach the end and see the horrific gargantuan den mother, a gurgling, screeching aversion of God's design with 40 legs, 400 eyes, and 4,000 teeth. Bethesda's games have traditionally employed a technique known as the step out moment. It's the moment when your character emerges from the vault in the Fallout games, or leaves the cave in Skyrim, and you're greeted with the sight of the open world sprawling out before you. It's intended to be an awe-inspiring visual presentation of the adventure that awaits you, and From Software would appear to be partial to using this method themselves. When you leave Yosefka's clinic at the start of the game, make a beeline over to the heavy wrought iron gates, and as the old gates swing open, you get your first view of the streets of Central Yharnam and the bridge in the distance. A little habit of mine is bringing the camera round to view my character ascending the various ladders in the game, and I find that these views are even more immaculate when they're framed like this. The way your character steadily clunks up the ladder, the silhouette of the sharp, stylish hunter garb against the backdrop of Yharnam's Gothic architecture is just so tasty, a real feast for the eyes. The cinematic photorealistic environments in Bloodborne are sensational, and entering a new area always carries a feeling of wonderment, satisfaction at the beautifully realised spaces, and also a little flutter of fear, knowing that what lies ahead is not going to be so pretty. It's a very special game that can make you feel all of those emotions at once. The Elden chapel bathed in the haze of incense, old Yharnam shrouded in smouldering fires and the distant imposing tower, and the one which sticks in my mind most vividly is the moment that you first see Hemwick Charnel Lane. Hanging a left at the base of the steps that lead to the Grand Cathedral will take you away from the urban area and into the woods. After eliminating the aggressive, mangled dogs and sharpshooters in the graveyard, you emerge onto the hilltop that looks out over Hemwick. A murder of crows flock away into the distance, drawing the player's eyes across an unfamiliar rural vista. Spiky towers and gnarled trees, the faint cackling noises of the nearby crones. It's a moment I'll never forget. It was introspective because in this moment I truly began to feel as if the game and its world was unfurling before me like a mist, like I was steadily peeling back the layers, finding my feet with the gameplay, and finally scratching my exploration itch by uncovering the various neighbourhoods of Yharnam. I think that it was the moment when I decided I was having fun. It's just one of Bloodborne's step-out moments, and it's a damn good one. There's a moment later on when the game shifts. It swerves abruptly and decisively down what the fuck street, and its true cosmic horror direction is divulged. The Forbidden Woods is a twisted, spooky forest consisting of thorned thickets, confusing pathways, and some hitherto unseen abominations. As the player heads further into the woods, they'll encounter tangled snake balls, Yharnamites whose heads explode, snakes erupting from their neck holes, bearing a striking resemblance to the Ganados in Resident Evil 4, and even some little blue guys. Now, I can't honestly say that I had much of a reaction to seeing these glowing-eyed, blue-skinned little fellas hanging around at the bottom of the garden. They're clearly not normal, but what even is normal at this point? At this stage, the player has already faced off a menagerie of beasts, all sorts of wild and wacky enemies, from werewolves to pigs the size of pickup trucks, so a couple of blue boyos doesn't seem that odd. I just thought they were funny little guys. Once you defeat the Shadows of Yharnam trio at the end of the Forbidden Woods, the path from the boss arena leads you to the site of Bergenworth College. As you proceed onto the forbidden grounds of the old school, you are greeted by a garden of eyes. Again, I don't remember thinking that these admittedly extremely creepy enemies felt out of place in context. Don't get me wrong, if I saw this in real life, I'd shit my pants. It's a hideous creature, an ungodly hybrid of man and insect that can pounce on you and proceed to chomp on your head, but it's still within the realms of possibility relative to what you've already seen. Further onto the college grounds, you'll encounter a squiddly-diddly man, a brain sucker, that bum rushes you at an alarming speed and probes your skull with its face straw, suckling your insight out of your cranium. You probably already met this guy in a back alley in the cathedral ward, and he definitely feels right at home on the moonlit college campus, chilling over there by the tree, waiting to extract your brain matter. A deeply strange and unsettling thing, that's for damn sure, and I don't like him one bit. But none of these zany villains compare to the fluorescent flower. The fluorescent flower is a multi-appendaged centipede mouth with an elongated sort of neck, with these tiny shiny feelers running all the way up its neck, and a glimmering flower on a stem protruding from it like an anglerfish, that shoots fireballs at you and belches luminous blue bile all over the floor. To say that this is without a doubt the most baffling and inconceivable cosmic monstrosity that the player has witnessed thus far would be selling the whole experience kind of short. It's a one-of-a-kind enemy in the base game. You only see one, this one, and it is quite simply a disgusting alien from beyond. I mean, come on, what the hell is that? What is that? The game has been flirting with overtly alien enemies up until this point, but this is the point at which the game lurches into full gear, full throttle cosmic horror nastiness, and from this point onward, the sheer amount of teeth, eyes and limbs that enemies have just gets a bit ridiculous. I thoroughly enjoyed Bergenworth from a horror perspective. I thought it was great, and I really loved this interaction. It's grotesque in a way that forces your attention. It's like a final boss in Resident Evil just appears at random slap bang in the middle of the game, never to be seen again. God only knows what it is, how it is, or why it's there. It just is. The only theory that makes much sense is that it has escaped the Chalice dungeons, and now it's just sort of dossing around Bergenworth in the pale light of the moon. You can find plenty more of them in the Chalice dungeons, but I'm not gonna talk about that. Sorry, I just don't care about the Chalice dungeons, they're whack. Interestingly, rather than ragdolling onto the ground like the common enemies, when you kill the fluorescent flower, a ghostly vortex opens up and swallows the deformed centipede bastard back from whence it came. Whence ever that is. Utter madness. I know that people often like to speculate what kind of mind-bending hallucinogenics game devs and concept artists were ingesting when they conceived things like this, but I have to believe that the truth is that 9 times out of 10 they were actually totally sober, which I find even more frightening, to be honest. Bloodborne fundamentally changed the way that I perceive gaming as a legitimate skill, a muscle that needs to be flexed and trained in order to grow in size. The unconventional way in which the game tutorializes the player, allowing them to spawn into an area to face the same foes time and time again, until they're literally forced to learn the game off by heart and the habits of its enemies, means that with enough time and patience you can and will best this tentacled monster. Unlocking the part of my brain that enables the ability to navigate these games is genuinely one of the best things I've probably ever done. I can probably count the number of people I know who I see in person on a regular basis who are Bloodborne fans on one hand, but when we discuss the game, it's well understood that this is a very special game, and having an intimate understanding and on a really basic level, just having the ability to play it, kinda makes me feel like I'm in a special club of dudes who rock. Throwing out a quote from an NPC and receiving a knowing smile, exchanging tips and tricks and discussing the lore, it begins to make sense to me why this game in particular among From Software's multiple masterpieces is so close to so many people's hearts. For me it's because it was my first, and you never forget your first, but it's bigger than that. It's an outlier in the Souls series in that it is an explicitly horror-centric experience, and it feels like FromSoft really made a piece of art here, made to their exact specifications. I think it's also significant that when Bloodborne fans discuss the game, a common theme seems to be that this isn't just a beloved brilliant game, an addictive, absorbing, riveting experience, it's their favourite game ever. Of all time, which is huge. I can't imagine what it feels like to create something like a video game or a piece of music, and for someone, or even millions of someone's, to confidently claim that it's their favourite thing. It's not even a controversial opinion in the wider Souls community to say that Bloodborne is my GOAT, and that really speaks to the game's quality. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to speak a little bit to the state of the game in 2024 and the community that sustains it, because there are some great reasons to stay locked in once you've conquered the game. There is a vibrant and thriving community of die-hard fans and relative newcomers like myself who have a firmly rooted obsession with this 10-year-old hack-and-slash diamond in the rough. However, discovering and eventually loving this game does have its downsides. It's easy to feel disheartened by the fact that Sony, who own the IP, have all but deemed Bloodborne and its fans as non-entities, keeping the game entombed in a dark box shackled by chains, a bit like the many coffins lining the streets of Yharnam. The game is still locked at 30 frames per second, there are stuttering problems which can even send it plummeting to the 20s, and while it certainly is a gorgeous game, it could really use a facelift. And aside from the old Hunters DLC, there has been no solid indication outside of speculation and outright hoaxes that fans will be getting any official content in the near or distant future. Or so we thought. I mean, kinda. I mean, not really, but kinda. As I was just about to start wrapping up the script for this video, Sony unveiled what I think is the first official Bloodborne content announcement since the DLC. Sony announced Astro Bot for PS5 at the latest State of Play, and it's a quirky platformer with a little cute character, which serves as a sort of homage fest to all of the beloved characters that have graced Sony's consoles over the years. Sony Australia sent out a tweet, a 3-second looping clip, showing the titular character sporting Yharnam hunter gear against a spooky backdrop, with the simple caption, Botborn. It turns out that if you buy the deluxe edition of the game, you'll be able to kit out your little boy as a hunter from Bloodborne, which is cute, but not very exciting. Unless maybe they're teasing the PC port. No, they're not. But wait! There's more! On the 9th of May of this year, a tweet from an account called ZubiTech seemed to indicate that Sony were dropping a brand new line of official Bloodborne merchandise. The tweet reads, PlayStation announces new merchandise for Bloodborne, introducing Bloodborne collaboration items full of dark charm. The lineup includes a pocket watch with the image of a stargazer, as well as boots and gloves that allow you to become a hunter, a gem for all Bloodborne fans. Please take a look at our carefully selected collaboration items that will increase your enlightenment.
Yes! Hell yeah! Hey, come on, baby! Come on! Yes!
Now, I'm sure there are some very happy hunter cosplayers and hardcore collectors out there, but this is pretty underwhelming in my opinion. I don't even know if this is actually real or official, but who cares? You know, I don't really want a stargazer watch or a pair of kinky gloves and hunter booties. I just want a performance patch at the bare minimum. For God's sake, man, come on. This is not good enough, not by a long shot. The consensus among hopeful fans who are itching to return to a smoother, updated Yharnam seems to be that Bluepoint Studios are the right team for the job. But the real hard grown-up truth is that this is just not going to happen, is it? I mean, I would hate it if Bluepoint gave Bloodborne the Demon Souls treatment. That'd be shit. You know, I mean, we all keep saying that we want this to happen and they don't do it, so maybe if we tell them that we don't want it, then they will do it. It's a bit of sort of telekinetic reverse psychology. But the issue that I do have while we're on the topic of remakes versus remasters is that I think it's really important to differentiate between the two. A game like New Vegas, for example, doesn't need a remaster. It doesn't. New Vegas can be modded to improve performance. It has to be modded, in my opinion. It can be retextured and you can install mods that introduce additional mechanics and content. What New Vegas hypothetically needs is a complete remake, so you're not just giving a lick of paint to a precariously stacked Jenga tower held together by twigs and gaffer tape. If you're gonna fix New Vegas, it's worth really fixing it, right? Or you may as well just stick with what you've got and be thankful that the game you love is still available to play and even mod with the right hardware. With regard to Bloodborne, it would be lovely if we could just have the same game with a 4K resolution and frame rate fix, perhaps some additional quality of life niceties, don't change too much. That would be a remaster. And just to clarify, I am in no way suggesting that Bloodborne is a squeaky clean, bug-free experience, where the only thing it's lacking is an unlocked frame rate and retexture. It's a bit wonky by nature. I'm simply saying that if that's all we can expect, then that would be acceptable. I mean, why stop at 60 frames per second? What I really want is to play it at 120 minimum and beyond on my PC. I just think it's important to manage expectations. And there are some mechanical issues that could use ironing out, like farming blood vials, that can get in the bin for starters, and not being able to travel directly to different areas from lamps, that sucks too. You could map the jump button to the left joystick like in Dark Souls 3. That would be easy enough, you would think, because the jump button's current classic implementation is, to be blunt, complete balls. And the biggest one for me is that I would be so grateful if you could remove gestures like you can in Elden Ring. I can't think how many times I've been in the middle of a boss fight or in amongst it with a gang of enemies, really out in the thick of it, and I've somehow activated a gesture, causing my character to nonchalantly sit down and proceed to get beaten fuck out of. That one just makes sense, I think. If we're talking about a remake from the ground up, give Bluepoint or somebody else the keys and let them do a Demon's Souls 2020, sure, I can absolutely get behind that too. I think everyone would absolutely lose their minds if this was announced. But knowing what I know about the current climate in the gaming industry, I'm still feeling a bit apprehensive and mistrustful, if you know what I mean. Because how much agency would the studio undertaking this task really have? Would they be able to use any of the iconic music? Would any of the legendary voice actors reprise their roles? And most importantly, how easy would it be for them to really capture the jagged, crackling ferocity of a game that, if we're being honest, is quite jank, but in a good way? Like, that's what makes the game feel so crooked and creepy. If Bloodborne gets the full treatment, I think it could end up being a very different feeling game. I don't hear this being discussed very often, but if the existing game gets a new patch, that will probably have major ramifications for speedrunners and people like me who like doing the tree skip in the Forbidden Woods. I mean, what if they just patch all the fun, goofy stuff out? I mean, what if they got rid of the dungeon? Maybe they'll patch out the cookie skip or the one reborn skip, or heaven forbid, fix the animation loop for Mikolash that allows him to be cheesed with poison knives. So I guess what I'm saying here is that it's good to be hopeful, and just to loop back around to two games that I've already mentioned in this video, Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space both received the remake treatment, and they were an absolute joy to play, the Dead Space remake especially, but just be careful what you wish for, I guess. I think if the Resi 4 and Dead Space remakes really showed us anything, it was that when a studio is dealing with a game with a fierce fanbase with extremely high expectations, they're only going to tackle something like that if they think that they can do the original material justice. The thing that nobody wants is like a half-baked spiritual successor that, despite some very tasty visuals and occasionally satisfying mechanics, falls miles short of what fans actually wanted. But of course Bloodborne did get a spiritual successor. We'll get to that in a minute. Since the release of Elden Ring, Bloodborne's fanbase has expanded, taking it from cult classic to simply classic. The game periodically enters a kind of renaissance, a resurgence, and the demand from fans old and new for either a remaster, remake or sequel is overwhelming. Miyazaki has said that he's well aware of and grateful for the authentic love and passion that fans have for his game, but he stated that he's not in a position to make that call even if he wanted to. And as you might expect, this has stoked the fires of speculation that perhaps work is underway and he just can't say anything about it just yet. Sorry guys, I believe that he's telling the truth here. Because, you see, Sony is like a sadistic bondage bitch, which has got my favourite game of all time strapped to a torture rack, and I can only surmise that they're cracking anyone across the hand with a hunter's cane if they try to reach out and undo its restraints. So, you know, if it happens, it happens, but in the meantime, I'm just going to continue happily playing the version that we have. And I'll also be playing any game which is in any way similar. I've noticed that some people are speculating that the reason Sony are refusing to budge, especially in light of this new merchandise news, is because they can't, that they've actually lost the source code, which I think is unlikely, but it would be quite the devastating act of unintentional cultural vandalism. There's no evidence for this, I mean there's no evidence for anything, but Jesus, can you imagine that? The fact that it's even a possibility which is getting people talking should be cause for concern. It was reported back in February of this year that FromSoft had actually acquired the rights for Elden Ring from Namco, with all of the paperwork signed off in March, no doubt owing to the 20 million copies that the game sold in its very first year. So I'm kind of sat here hoping, no, praying that they may be able to do the same with Bloodborne. Please? Cope is a hell of a drug. It's not all doom and gloom though, as time and time again, the community has taken matters into their own hands to great effect. A 60 FPS patch engineered by Lance McDonald does exist, provided you have a PS4 Pro with the correct firmware and you're committed to jailbreaking it. A PS1 style demake Bloodborne PSX was developed by indie game dev Lilith Walther, which was a huge success. Lilith has also recently brought a long-standing meme in the community to life with the release of Bloodborne Kart. Well, not Bloodborne Kart exactly. Unfortunately, the name had to be changed right at the 11th hour to Nightmare Kart, and much of the game's content has been overhauled to be legally distinct, as not content with doing absolutely nothing whatsoever with their own IP, giving content-starved Bloodborne fans a fat load of nothing for almost 10 years, Sony decided that they were going to slap Lilith and her co-conspirators with some kind of C&D. As disappointing as I'm sure this was, I have played the finished product, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a real labour of love from a certified community legend, and the tweaks and alterations that had to be made to the game certainly adds a level of meta-comedy to the experience. Another project worth highlighting is the Bloodborne Minecraft mod by developer Potomy, which is well underway, and it's fascinating to keep track of it, especially from a Minecraft non-participant's perspective. They're seemingly determined to recreate not just the physical world, and what they've already finished is staggering in scale, but it would seem that they're also trying to rebuild the actual game itself front to back in this format. And honestly, it might be the reason that I finally get involved with Minecraft. Anything's possible. The attitude among creative fans does seem to amount to something like, if we're not going to get a PC port or a console performance patch or a sequel or a remake or anything from Sony, then we will create our own content and our own homages to this game, which was made abundantly clear with the release of the infectiously fun and exceptionally tasty Lies of P in 2023. It's a Souls-like based around the story of Pinocchio, which expertly marries the stylish aggression of Bloodborne with the precision parrying and posture-breaking brutality of Sekiro, and I was totally hooked on it last year. It is such a solid and refined experience, which is sadly not something that can be said for some AAA games with a bajillion-dollar budgets. It's Pinocchio born Kiro, and it not only honours the games it draws direct influence from, but in some cases actively improves on some mechanics entirely. Your ergo count is highlighted in blue when you have the amount that you need to level up. NPC and quest item icons will appear next to locations on the fast travel menu so that you can keep track of the various quest lines, and probably most ingenious is P's weapon crafting system. Weapons are now divided into handles and blades, which can be disassembled and swapped around to produce different movesets and abilities. The perfect guard is so satisfying to pull off. Sparks go flying, enemies' weapons will snap in two, and the hefty clang of the weapons making contact is so tactile and heavy and sick. The game really encourages you to master the perfect guard, rather than relying solely on dodging. It really is a sublime game from beginning to end, with replay value in abundance, and if you're a fan of Bloodborne, this is a must play. And it's the closest thing we currently have to a proper remake or a sequel. Ed, if you're watching this, please, just play the game, please, I'm begging you. I don't think I could make a video about Bloodborne and subsequent Born-likes without mentioning The Last Faith. The Last Faith is a crowd-funded indie Souls-like Metroidvania, with characters, gameplay, setting and style clearly influenced by Bloodborne and Blasphemous. I'm not historically a massive Metroidvania guy, but I've often heard the Souls games characterised as being 3D Metroidvanias, with backtracking, platforming, hidden pathways and secrets, and the way that unlocking your character's abilities are staggered until the late game. I can kinda see that. The Last Faith is great fun, with some genuinely challenging boss encounters and a gorgeous pixelated art direction. So I think it's fair to say that my Souls itch has progressed rapidly to a full body rash at this point, and I'm always looking for the next fix. It's funny to me really that my fixation started by taking a punt on a second-hand copy of a game that I had seen a meme about on the internet, which I bought for 15 quid at my local CEX. As it stands, I have finished Bloodborne upwards of 20 times, my total playtime sits at around 300 hours, I've got the Platinum Trophy, and I've done a BL4 run. Something keeps pulling me back in, an almost robotic, machine-like impulse to fire it up and clean sweep Central Yharnam that I just can't resist. I love playing this game. There's something deeply alluring and enduring about the worlds that Miyazaki and From Software like to create. They're harrowing depictions of a world bereft of identifiable human life, and the few NPCs that you do interact with are often broken, downtrodden and distressed, and in Bloodborne almost certainly doomed to meet with a terrible end. The waking world can often feel like a nightmare that you can't escape from, and even certain images and actions that you perform in games can sometimes creep into your subconscious mind. I'm prone to night terrors and lucid dreaming, and when I dream, sometimes I see horrible things, shadowy humanoids and unspeakable creatures that leap out from the darkness to attack me. I even experience frighteningly real sensations of pain and pressure. I once had a dream where I found myself on a cobblestone street with Victorian buildings, and I remember thinking in the dream, oh no, not Yharnam. At that moment, a gigantic monster rose into my field of vision, a flaming, roaring creature reminiscent of the Balrog from the Fellowship of the Ring. I felt really small, vulnerable and weak against the faceless, towering Goliath. The feeling of that dawning realization that I had woken up in the world of Bloodborne was deeply unnerving. I suppose that's testament to just how scary this game actually is. But the journey of overcoming the fear, mastering the gameplay, beating every boss, getting the platinum trophy, and devoting myself to achieving something that seemed so far out of my reach has been fulfilling, life-affirming, and fun. And now there's nothing left for this game to throw at me. It's not unusual for games to make us reflect on the fragility and, in some cases, the horror of our lives. Unseen airborne pandemics and mental conditions, addiction, the unknown and uncertain. Life isn't fair, and that's something that every one of us has to contend and reconcile with at some point. But if you can be certain of anything, as I am now, is that all it takes is time, practice, patience, and a firm commitment to head back in through the fog, to confront your worst fears again and again, until suddenly the lumbering, deformed, howling horrors aren't so frightening anymore. It's just another day in the UK. I sincerely hope that you've had a good time with this lengthy meditation on Bloodborne. Maybe I've said some stuff that you agree with or maybe disagree with, but I just wanted to share my perspective on this fantastic game, as well as to air out some of my frustrations about its lengthy spell of captivity in the Sony vault. I hope you're all enjoying the Elden Ring DLC and Nightmare Cart, and I can only hope that From Software and Souls-like fans will stay winning in 2025 and beyond. Thank you so much for checking out my video, I really appreciate it. Please hit the like and subscribe button and keep the conversation about Bloodborne going in the comments. I love talking to people about it. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.